So we've seen that there's an association between emotions and physiological responses. But how are these two things linked? Or in other words, what causes what? Does an emotion lead to a physiological response? Or does a physiological response lead to the identification of an emotion? Or is there some more complicated interaction between these two things? We'll dig into what psychologists have postulated over the years regarding this association. So we're going to talk about the sight of a threatening and approaching grizzly bear and the associated emotion of fear. The intuitive view, which is not necessarily true, would be that we have this bear stimulus that leads to an emotion, in this case fear, and that emotion leads to some physiological change or arousal state. In this case, that would include a pounding heart, trembling, shaking, sweating, and running away. But there are other ways that this link between emotion and arousal could occur. An early hypothesis proposed to describe this is called the James-Lange theory, named after the two psychologists, James and Lange, who developed this idea independently in the late 1800s. And this theory says that the response of the body to a stimulus is what's used to deduce the emotion. So here we'll bring our stimulus down. So with this James-Lange theory, the stimulus leads to a change in arousal, and that leads to the identification of the emotion fear. So what evidence supports this hypothesis? Well, we can look at the physiological patterns associated with emotions, and we see that different patterns are associated with different primary emotions. And so when we're talking about these patterns, we're talking about changes in heart rate, changes in blood pressure, changes in the brain regions that are activated, all sorts of body changes. So different body changes for different emotions. Also, we've got the facial feedback hypothesis that supports this James-Lange theory. And here I'm going to show you that.
So researchers have shown that if you change your facial expression, you change your perceived emotion. So if you look at a comic and you force yourself to smile, like doing something like this, you'll find it more funny or more amusing than if you force yourself to frown and look at the same comic like this.
So to summarize this facial feedback hypothesis, the body state affects our perceived emotion. And so that would imply that the arousal state comes before the identified emotion. But there are some criticisms of the James-Lange theory that have emerged since it was originally proposed. First, the autonomic nervous system is too slow to explain all of the emotional responses that we observe. So oftentimes we see emotions that are perceived before a body change occurs. And so that body response, that autonomic nervous system activation occurs too slowly to be used to identify the emotion as the James-Lange theory proposes. Also, we've seen evidence that different emotions can actually produce similar physiological responses. We might see an elevated heart rate for happiness and for fear, for example. So in response to these criticisms, the Cannon-Bard theory was proposed in the early 1900s. This is a different theory that describes the link between emotions and physiological changes in the body in response to a stimulus. According to this theory, the hypothesis is that the emotional and physical responses to a stimulus occur independently but at the same time. So in the case of our example, we'll copy these components down here. Our stimulus leads to the arousal state at the same time that the stimulus leads to the identification of the emotion. So the scary bear leads to the physiological changes like heart pounding and trembling at the same time the fear emotion is identified. This theory assumes that body responses have no influence on emotion, and this was already shown not to be the case as we saw with the facial feedback hypothesis up here. The Schachter-Singer two-factor theory is a more recent theory that tried to reconcile these problems with the earlier theories. This was proposed in the 1960s. So these two psychologists, Schachter and Singer, saw that physiological arousal can be similar for many emotions. And so they said that we use context to create a label to identify the emotion involved. So there are cognitive processes that are going on in addition to the physiological response that are used to identify the emotion. So here we've got our stimulus. This leads to some change in the body, some arousal state, but this could be similar for different emotions. And so once the arousal state is detected, a label is formed. In this case, the label might be, that's one scary bear, I'm afraid of it. And that label, that contextual label that's arrived at through a cognitive process, is used to identify the emotion, in this case, fear. This implies that with different contexts, the same stimulus might lead to different emotions. So if we have the same bear stimulus, that leads to some arousal state, but the bear is actually in a cage at the zoo, the label is going to be different. In this case, the cognitive label will be, that scary bear is in a cage. I'm excited to see it. So that's the label that's placed on this reaction. That leads to a different emotion, an emotion of excitement that's identified. So here, we might have the same physiological state of arousal. We have a similar stimulus, but the context of the stimulus changes the label that leads to a different emotion identified. And again, this labeling process is a cognitive process. So coming up in class, we'll look at empirical evidence supporting this two-factor theory that I just described. That's one attempt to explain the interaction between emotions and physiological responses. There are many theories to describe how emotions arise, and here we've focused on three: the James Lange theory, the Cannon-Bard theory, and the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory, which we'll learn more about in class. But there are others that are outside the scope of this course that you would learn about if you were to pursue future study in psychology.